Thanks both. That was really, really powerful. I loved the use of case studies with the kind of overarching principles of the paradigm. We've had lots of questions that I've been working through while you've been talking. So some of it has actually been a bit of reflection as well, particularly on kind of like the original reasons that we became structural engineers. I don't think we often reflect back to that, to be honest, when we're swept up with the day's work. But we've had a few reflections which I wanted to share, that people felt that they had become a structural engineer to help humankind. Some people said they just wanted to do build good buildings for people to use, schools, hospitals. So I think it's been quite useful to people to look back in that sense. But I'd be interested to hear continued in the inbox and how people think they could challenge their mindset and kind of maybe take it back to what you guys have said about why we became engineers. But obviously that also has us looking forward. And Ollie, you did mention the topic of looking to the future. And there's been a couple of questions about what the future of our industry actually looks like. Often people probably think that means building more, building bigger. But how does our industry look in a regenerative space? Do you want to go for it, Ollie?
Yeah, I think let's tag team, James. And great.
Yeah, come on.
That's a great question. What does the future of our industry look like? I think one of the big shifts for us is to see what regenerative design gets us to think about is how does the act of building things make things better? So that actually I see us, so when James and I both see us, challenge me if I'm wrong, James, but like, it's just in a sense like a GP might exist in a community and is interested in community health. I think we're also interested in community thriving, but what we deal in is materials and buildings and water and flow and traffic and transport. And so actually it's a different mindset for our industry. It's still serving a really, really important need, but rather than thinking about sort of individual projects, we might think about actually what is this wider community need. One of the things, little quirks that I love is, I don't know if anyone's heard of this, but there's something called the Pyramus and Thisbe Society. And the Pyramus and Thisbe Society provide guidance on party wall agreements, on how to look after party walls. So you may probably know this, that actually when you have a party wall in a construction, you need to appoint someone to represent the wall. And actually, if there's a problem, that person then decides, well, is it one person who's undermined the wall, or another one? And that's a really unusual quirk of law, but I think it's actually a really interesting point. I think that in the future, I think we'll be representing more the places, the communities, and the materials. And that's not, we've been there before. We have had council engineers and community engineers and public engineers, but I think there's much more of a sense of our industry serving a wider community rather than just delivering projects and moving on to the next one. Much more rooted in place. I'll yield to James. James.
Great, thanks, Ollie. Yeah, no, that's an excellent answer. I've just written down three phrases: supply chain uncertainty and testing. Let me unpack those for you. So something we didn't mention in our presentation, but has been really fundamental to me in my understanding of this space, is this idea of the second site. The second site is the site where our materials come from. It's the site where our materials travel through and are manufactured and processed. And it's the site where all the waste that we generate goes. And the reason the second site is so important is because for a long time, me and Ollie would have conversations about the biodiversity part of the climate and biodiversity emergency. And I think, like probably most people, was like, listen, I'm a structural engineer. I'm not doing landscape architecture. I don't see my role in this conversation. Like, I'm designing the structure of the building. Where is the biodiversity in that? Like, someone else is choosing the planting outside my building. Someone else is deciding whether it's got a green roof or not. I just don't picture it. And I had this real aha moment that actually, hang on a minute, there is this second site that every beam that I use has come from somewhere. There is impact in the way that the material is harvested or mined. There is impact in the way the material is manufactured. There is impact in the way that the material is transported. And that was a real aha moment. And for me, the regenerative engineer of the future doesn't just specify stuff. They understand supply chains, and they really have a deep connection with supply chains. They use materials which they don't just know it ticks a certain box for a grade or a strength, but they actually use materials they know are coming from places which are doing good, or at least they're doing no harm. They're utilizing waste materials. They're utilizing materials that are maybe being reused from somewhere else. And they've really understood the supply chain. And at the moment, we don't understand the supply chain, not really. We understand little bits of it. And we've done a great job of trying to actually map the impact of our materials in terms of the embodied carbon. All of that carbon is happening pretty much off-site. Very little of that embodied carbon is happening on our site. Most of it is happening on the second site. It's happening everywhere else. And so we've already done that, but we haven't understood, the impact of our supply chains on things like biodiversity. We haven't understood the impact of our supply chain on industry. We haven't, I was at an engineering practice and we were discussing this the other day, and someone mentioned modern slavery. I have no idea how many people were involved in modern slavery on the supply chains of the projects I worked on. It was a question I never even thought to ask. And I think the regenerative engineer of the future will know. And whilst I think we have to avoid saying everything will come from X distance from the site, 3 miles, 5 miles, pick your number, I do think there is a real logic to say that the shorter the distance, the easier it is to understand our supply chain. And the better we understand our supply chain, the more confident we can be of the positive and negative impacts of the materials that we use. So that's part one, is better understanding of supply chain. So, kind of a specification turning from something that we have to produce in order to get our tenders out to a real instrument for change. The second one is uncertainty. I'm uncertain about uncertainty, but I'm also excited about uncertainty. We deal with uncertainty all the time. It's everywhere in our design. Every number we use actually isn't a definite number. It's an uncertain number. But as engineers, I think we've lost contact and we've lost connection with that uncertainty. And the thing I'm excited about is actually engineering becoming more interesting mathematically, because we're actually going to start to have to model things better and understand uncertainty better. When we're using existing building materials, we can't just use the codes, because the codes weren't designed for existing buildings. They're designed for new buildings. So we need to understand the codes. We need to understand how things were designed at the time. We need to understand causes of uncertainty going forward. This to me is exciting as someone who's a bit of a maths bod as well. I'm excited about that. And the last thing I think, just following up, is testing. I think the regenerative engineer is going to spend a lot more time making and breaking stuff. But they're not just going to rely on other people's knowledge. They're actually going to have a much more tangible experience of making something and testing it and seeing if it performs in the way that they want it to. But because they're using materials that they understand that are on their supply chain, because they're managing all of this uncertainty. And I think that's quite exciting. When I imagine what I thought an engineer was going to be like as a young person, and when I went into it, I think I was expecting to kind of get my hands dirty and be in the lab and make stuff and break stuff and, do some maths and be relating to all the different people as well in my supply chain. To me, this is an exciting future. It just is quite different to where we are now.
Thanks both. To be honest, James, one of the most powerful things that I saw when I first kind of started to understand regenerative principles was an image you showed of a site boundary and the decisions you make that affect the site boundary, and then the decisions you make that affect outside of that, and thinking of the site boundary as a body. So what you put in your body, the decisions you make about your own personal body, but then it's the effect that your body has on the surrounding environment that you can't necessarily control. So yeah, I think that concept of beyond our sight is quite good in visualizing potentially where we're thinking at the moment and where we should be thinking beyond. Obviously, you mentioned supply chain, and there has been quite a few questions in terms of like how powerful are structural engineers in kind of making those decisions in terms of supply chain. You know, there's recommendations we can make, but how far does the influence lie, and how can we be influencing our clients? And does it pose the question about how our projects are financed and governed, and the kind of like higher up level that maybe limits some of the like influence from the best intentions that we would have in the decisions we make with design or supply chain?
I think I can pick a question out in that. As well. We're trying to put that. I mean, yeah, there's always a question of agency. I talk about the pizza of concern and the pizza of influence. The things that we might be concerned about might be a very big pizza, and in the middle of it is the pizza of influence, of what we can influence. And actually, we can probably influence more than we think. And what we're trying to build is a community of practitioners that are actually trying to challenge and support each other to make that broader change. That's the point of the Regenerative Design Lab. That's the point of sessions like today. It's the point of writing this book, is to try and figure out how we can support each other to be braver in doing that. What does it look like? Probably intervening earlier on. The earlier you can intervene, the bigger. As with any conceptual design, the earlier you can intervene, the better. Ask the bigger question. It's not, and Will Arnold at the Institution of Structural Engineers talks about this a lot, shifting from output to outcome. Not like changing the brief so that it's not how do we build a building, but how does the process of creating a building here make some of that world a bit better? Can we use this as an opportunity to pioneer a new material? Can we use it as an opportunity to change local planning rules, or get the planning committee on board with a more like area-wide approach to biodiversity, or whatever it happens to be? So like with each one, when James showed that diagram of the systems bookcase with some arrows pointing upwards, like how does your individual project become an opportunity to go higher? And I think last thing is like, probably your clients want things to be better as well. Actually trying to explore with them what their hopes are around this project. Now, obviously, that's at a design scale. There are lots of factors. There are factors at policy level, at local planning rules, all those things. But I think engineers have the opportunity to try and challenge those. We see what Architects Declare are doing by actually going into Parliament at the moment, trying to influence the manifestos of the parties that are coming in to do something much more substantial around building efficiency and circular economy. And we see this happening at the level of cities as well. So there are campaign groups, as James says, get involved, start trying to influence the space. And if we can influence the space, that changes what we can do on the projects.
Yeah, thanks both. And to be honest, we are a very well respected like profession, and we have a lot of like influence. People value like the work that we do. So, you know, getting involved at an early stage and, you know, sharing what you guys have heard say, the knowledge that we have on the regenerative space. There has obviously been quite a lot of questions in terms of industry, but there has also been questions in terms of education. Obviously, that is where a lot of our next generation of engineers start. They'll most likely do a degree in structural engineering. So there was a question which, James, I hope as a lecturer, you will also, as a professor, you would have some input in this. But it's how does regenerative engineering look in education, from teaching, also the campuses and the spaces that people learn, and how you can maximise the utilisation of where people learn, and the spaces that we are also probably building.
That is a great question, which requires probably a fair amount of unpacking, and I don't know if we've got time for all of it right now. So I'll try and summarize it fairly succinctly. I think there are lots of different things going on. The first thing we can do is think about what are the tools that our students need to be able to be regenerative practitioners, and are we giving them those tools? So I'm challenging myself a lot at the moment to think differently about education. So are we giving them the systems tools that they need to understand kind of the system side of things? Are we giving them the real almost kind of basics of sort of probability, uncertainty, modeling of things? Do our students really know? And do we teach them kind of, I don't know, like von Mises stresses, or do we just say, here's a beam and this is, omega L squared over 8, and off you go, and without really unpicking that stuff? And the reason that stuff is important is because in the future, we might find that there are things we assume and we take for granted now that you cannot take for granted anymore. I'll give you a simple example. I've been reviewing a book on bamboo design for the iStruct T, and bamboo design is conceptually very different to how you approach steel and concrete design, because bamboo is a brittle material and the way it fails is very different to the way that steel and concrete fail, and the way therefore you have to go through the entire design process is like a completely different paradigm, and I don't think we educate at that base level about those sort of paradigms. We don't really expand upon kind of the lower and upper bound theorem. We don't really expand upon all sorts of things, and that's not to say that we've got it wrong. Because actually we've been educating for the future that currently exists, and I've been a big proponent of educating in that way. I've worked hard to make my teaching authentic and to feel like it is well situated in the current world. But as we're starting to unlock this new potential, as we're starting to ask these new questions, I think the curriculum does need to change. But probably the two biggest changes that we need to provide to our students are first of all the ability to self-learn, because as you would have noticed, not all the books are written in the bookshelves yet. So they're going to enter into an industry where hopefully things are changing and potentially quite rapidly, and therefore they're going to need to be able to self-learn. And the other thing that they're going to need to be able to do, and I've realized this is quite a jump in my mind and in my thinking, is they need to be able to challenge upwards. Because the unfortunate truth is, we've known about the climate emergency since the 1970s. We've been designing and thinking about low carbon design since the early 2000s. My first project won awards for being low carbon design. These are not new conversations. These are old conversations. And the reality is the changes that we need to happen haven't happened. And actually, I think it ties back into the last question. I don't think engineers have really understood the agency they have in this space. I think we could step up is the wrong word, but I think we've too quickly said, this is outside of my domain, I can't do this, and so I'm going to put it in the too difficult box. And I'm not saying that as a academic in a preachy way. I'm saying it as a practitioner who spent 15 years designing buildings and absolutely did that. I absolutely said, I know that this building is not as low carbon as it should be. I know that price has driven it, and I've decided not to challenge that in a way that I could do. So I'm not saying that in a way of judgment. I'm saying that in a way of reflection from my own practice. But as a result, our graduates, when they come into industry, they need to be able to challenge upwards. They need to be able to say to the people they're working with, the way you're doing things is not okay. And it let's be honest, guys, it either needs to change, or I'm either leaving this company or I'm leaving this industry. Like that is the world, unfortunately, that we are creating and have created, and therefore I think that's probably the biggest challenge for our graduates. And on the flip side, the best thing we can do is to try and understand work with them, because you'd be amazed at how much they're already learning in this space. A lot of our graduates are so well prepared for this new world, and it's when they come into industry and they hit the reality of that actually a lot of that stuff is not yet fully utilized. Does that make sense? I feel like that was a bit mean. It wasn't meant to be mean. It was like, but it's
No, I echo that, to be fair. Like, I advocate any university I go in and doing a talk, any of the graduate engineers that come through the company I work for, to challenge. Business as usual has got us into the position we're in now, and fresh sets of minds who are, wanting to make a difference, challenging that is how we're going to make some significant change. So, you mentioned obviously the topic of, like, you're reviewing the bamboo book, and your material and product of ModCell has got quite a few questions, particularly around structural codes and fire testing. And do we currently have a skills gap or a code gap that prevents us utilising materials such as straw and mod cell. And yeah, a lot of questions regarding the fire and if, how the fire testing was, and if you had to provide any treatment to the mod cell, and did that then outweigh the sustainable benefits?
Yeah, I'd like to not answer those questions, not because I don't want to, but because it's not, to me, mod cell is not it's not the material that matters. I will answer it in as much as saying that yes, there was lots of fire testing done. Panels were put in, taken to the BRE. They went through all of the rigorous fire testing. The panels were insurable. That was a big part of the process. But really, to me, that's not. The bit about the regenerative is different. I think the thing about codes is a very different question and a really important one. I'm going to be honest. I'm a massive fan of the Euro codes, and I'm a massive fan of them because they are really brave in that they have this Eurocode principles of design, Eurocode 0, and in that code it kind of says, look, if you can't use all the other codes, then here is some statistical stuff that you can actually utilize. If you dig into the appendices of that code, there is actually a wealth of information which does enable you, in the right circumstances, with the right level of testing, with the right, approaches, to actually design with novel materials, which is actually really exciting. It facilitates more change than we think is there. The issue is the skills gap, and it's not a simple one to solve. And I'll be honest, I'm interested in this space in a big way because I can see its potential, but it's also not something that I'm comfortable with because I didn't really do the whole statistical understanding and all of that. And so there is an ongoing conversation. I'm working with some colleagues to try and draw some of this stuff out and think about how can we educate engineers to really be able to utilize what is already there in the codes to do this work. And I think for regenerative design is one thing. I actually think the bigger question right now is around reuse of existing buildings and really understanding what the codes are trying to achieve and what is safe and what is not safe and how we properly statistically model those existing buildings. I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
Thanks, James. I'm going to take it back to the topic of community. That is obviously quite a fundamental when we've been talking about regenerative design. Obviously, potentially it's not been an area where structural engineers traditionally are heavily involved in community engagement beyond maybe end user use of a building, where it may affect our designs. How would you suggest that as engineers and design team members, we are getting involved more with the community? Do you think it's something that, planning requirements should require more community engagement of the new developments? So what can we do in terms of engineers in design teams, in communities, but then also, is there a lack of kind of like local authority legislation that lets communities be distanced from new developments?
If I start with this, a great question. We were in the House of Commons last week, and this Architects Declare launch. And one of the people said is, one of the peers who was at that meeting kind of said, look, we can pass this legislation, we can take these rules, and you've got to start doing this yourselves. So actually, the climate emergency is an emergency. We will get changes in legislation, hopefully, but actually we need to start doing some of this work. So what does that mean? That means, I think, actually starting to re-embed ourselves in the communities in which we are working. So James and I have a model which we call continuous place-based design, which starts off with this idea of observation, like deep observation, like really getting to know the places that you're working in. What are they rich in? What was there before, which has somehow got lost, which could be unlocked? What does this community care about? What are the skills that are in there? What if push came to shove, could they do there? What's missing? What are the opportunities? And that also applies to the ecosystem, that wider community of being. What is it rich in? Where are things thriving? Where are the little places where there's lots of stuff living? Where are things being held back? Has the ground been poisoned or whatever? And so nothing's growing. Trying to really understand those places, informing our our interconnection with those. Because once we do that, we could start to be in a propositional space where we can actually start to approach a council or a community centre or whatever and say, well, actually, I think there's an opportunity for us to do here. We have to build these relationships of trust. And actually, we don't know what's going to come up. We have three mindsets that we talk about. One is a mindset of interdependence, recognizing we're reliant on these communities. The second one is the mindset of abundance, looking for what could happen. And the third one, the emergence, is actually allowing for the possibility that if you enter into conversations with people, new opportunities will pop up. And that's very different from how we normally frame our interaction. So I would say it's about entering into your community with curiosity, with looking for opportunities and being willing to engage with people and say, look, what could we do here? I know that sounds very, very vague, but actually it is. Regenerative design is an act of healing. It is about making things better. If we want to destroy, we can be indiscriminate. But if we want to heal, we have to be super specific, which means we have to really take care and pay attention to the places that we're working with. And to come back to the second site earlier on, the places we are working are, we have this phrase, it's not just where we make, but where we take. The places, the materials, as far as for the regenerative designer, the site, it's just as much where things are coming from as where they are going to. So we need to form a relationship with the places where these things are coming from. Now, sure, we're not going to find every single material that we're sourcing from around the world, but what if we actually really started to think about the main material? Where's the sand coming from? We extract so much sand. If we could find out what is the impact of our interactions there and actually start to think about what might be a better interaction, then that could be really, really powerful.
Yeah, I think often when we think of community engagement, we think of volunteering in terms of maybe like litter picking and things like that. But we actually have quite an opportunity in our professional aspect. So if we're doing new developments on the edge of an area, are we then going in, engaging and saying, do you know what, we're going to also do some surveys on the local schools and offering our like healing in terms of our professional like abilities, because that's quite powerful and quite an expensive service for a lot of people that they can't access, and where we find that issues happen in terms of like structural failures because people don't keep up with that maintenance, etc. That we have the power to volunteer as well within local communities.
I think the community of the second site is the really interesting thing for us. It's like otherwise it's very easy for us to focus on the first site, but actually it's the other place, the place that we don't see. Unless we start to really engage and interconnect with that place, I think we're not going to have any impact. We're not going to start to have a positive impact. It all becomes too remote.
Do you think there's been quite a few questions on like the scalability of multi-story buildings and that kind of thing, which we'd spoken before and you did expect a few questions on that. I guess, do you think that we are potentially trying to fit a traditional building mindset into a regenerative space? And does the future look like we don't work on those kind of projects? We see businesses challenging the kind of projects that they work on that don't align with the principles that they're embedded.
James, do you want to go first?
Yeah, why not? Let's have a crack at this one. Scalability is complex. To me, I panic when I hear the word scalable, because it to me, it kind of fits in our current paradigm of how do we kind of make everything as efficient as possible. So we reduce all materials down to simple numbers, and then we turn a handle and we just produce a lot. But I'm also aware that we need to build, and we need to build a lot. And I think something we haven't really said yet, but I think is really key, and is a big part of actually the goal of regenerative design, is this idea of co-evolving. I think there is a danger that people like me and Ollie look like we're advocating for making stuff like we did back in 1837 or whenever it is that you could pick. And that is absolutely not what we're advocating for, because the global population has exploded since then. and we need to be providing housing and places for people to thrive and survive globally for that population. And that is not going to happen by building things in the same way as we did back in 18, whichever year I said back then. So I can imagine a world in which we do have regenerative multi-story buildings. But I guess my challenge is thinking, what does that look like in my context? Not because in my context it's what's the right word, not possible, but almost because in my context, is it necessary? So do we need to build more buildings in my context, or do we need to reuse the buildings we already have? I think there are places around the world where there is desperate need for construction, and there is desperate need to be utilizing the materials that we have. And let's be honest, all materials are finite. There is not an infinite amount of sand. There is not an infinite amount of steel. So we need to be stewarding these materials. And I guess my question becomes, when I think of what does a 12-story regenerative building look like, I don't think I can imagine it here in the UK, because I think I'm reaching that point and thinking, well, hang on a minute, we've probably got enough 12-story buildings, and why are we not utilizing what we've got now? Maybe there is a way forward. I actually wrote a piece which I think is in the book. I can't remember now, because we wrote quite a lot and some of it didn't make the final cut, about extending existing tall buildings and making them even taller. And I think there is definitely a place in regenerative design for doing things like that. I can see our land being better utilized. I'm not anti high rise. I just think there is a global issue here, and we need to be thinking, whilst we need to be thinking locally in terms of our materials, material supply, our community, we also need to acknowledge that the biggest impact of our actions is going to be felt by the poorest people in the world, and the biggest need for resource going forward for the next 30 years or 50 years is also required by the poorest people in our world. And therefore, there is a question about how do we, as people who are wealthier, make better use of what we already have. I feel like it's a sideways answer, but so there is some scalability, but it isn't in the simple way that we think about it.
Go ahead, Ollie.
I think it's a really great question. It's really important, as for all the reasons we said about the need that we have. But let's just think about this. So one of our key ideas in the book is to use living systems themselves as a guide for what is the decisions we should make as designers. Now, scalability is fundamentally rooted in the paradigm of continuous growth. Let's keep scaling this. But actually, that's not how living systems work. Living systems tend to enrichen rather than scale up. You might get multiplication of things, but within the ecosystem limits. We have a logistic curve. There becomes a point at which something which is no longer sustained by that ecosystem, and then it evolves out. We don't do speculative construction in the living world. You don't get a tree as actually, I'm going to try and put a branch out here and see if anyone buys it. Everything develops in response to the needs of the system. I look around where I live, I see high-rise commercial developments going up that I just don't fundamentally believe that we need. They're not actually what the human and living system around here needs. We've probably got, where I live, a lot of the buildings that we need already. Not all of them. There's a lot of existing housing which is in desperate need of upgrading, but not massive multi-story developments. That's not what our living system, that's what our human system needs. So I think it's about really tuning back into what is the system trying to do? What is there a scarcity of? What is there an abundance of? We have some great case studies in the book. For example, Yes Make organization I love, I love what they do, which is in London. They harvest urban street trees, which are scheduled for being cut down because they're diseased or they're dangerous. What happens at the moment? 5,000 trees a year in London get cut down and then they get incinerated. And they're saying, hang on a sec, we've got trees here. Can we use those as timber for construction? And so they've set up a yard. They treat the timber. They use the local they use a workforce of the local economy. They train people up in green wood skills. They cut the timber. They co-design local structures, and they build them. And they use 3D modeling to scan the crowns, so they can actually use those as nodes for much more complicated structures. Now you could say, how does that scale up? Of course, we're not going to chop down all the street trees in order to grow their business. Their answer is, Well, when we've exhausted this source, we'll find something else to work with. It's about working with what's in abundance rather than taking a thing going, great, let's scale it up and chop down all the trees. Sorry, long answer. Hope that helps.
I think it's important. Sorry, go ahead, James.
Well, no, I was just going to say, maybe you're going to say the same, Neve. I agree with all that me and Ollie have been saying. I'm agreeing with myself, but I think it's also really important to come back to that three horizons piece. And I think for some people, they might be feeling very uncomfortable with what me and Ollie are talking about. And that is really understandable. We really get that. And I think there is this need to really acknowledge and not underestimate the need for transition. That we're not suggesting, right, from tomorrow, everybody is just doing everything differently, but actually we need to imagine a future and then work towards it. And we don't see that happening in 5 minutes or 5 weeks or 5 years, but we would really like us to transition over the next decade or so that by 2050, the world that we live in, the world that we're designing, the way that we operate is radically different to how it is now. And we look back and go, wow, that's incredible. I can't believe we got there. But at the same time, we don't kind of look at the next 5 minutes and say, oh, flip, I've got to go to work tomorrow and I can't face it, because it's so, James and Ollie told, do you know what I mean? Like we need to understand that the transition needs to be, sustainable. We need to sustain ourselves in that transition as well. And we need to encourage each other and work at a pace that is, possible, rather than create an impossible task and then just give up, because giving up is about the worst thing we could possibly do.
I think that's probably why a lot of people, I did at first as well, found it quite hard to understand that the regenerative design could ever really be applicable in construction, because we come from an industry where you can't even get legislation in embodied carbon yet or anything like that in terms of structure. One thing I did want to mention that we haven't really said yet, obviously, we have a very wide range of audience attending, not all from the UK. Obviously, the experience that we're sharing today, for us three, we are both all based in the UK, in an industry where we have never really had to consider limited resources, and that is the situation we're in. We focus on lean design and often those things because we're having to scale it back, whereas some people on the call may be in a situation where, those kind of principles are already embedded because that's, the society that they're in or the resources that are available. I've seen in some of the presentations you guys have delivered before, some really great examples from different countries across the world, living root bridges and stuff like that, which, using resources in a regenerative way, but not necessarily in the situation that we are in. I'm obviously conscious of time, so we've got a couple of minutes left for a few last questions. So I'm going to give you two last questions to finish today's session. Obviously, we have said the word regenerative design a lot today. We could be on another presentation where we hear the word net zero or sustainable design, and sometimes there's a risk that those words become diluted or they become a buzzword. How many times have we been in a meeting where you might have already started to hear the word regenerative? You even hear it now on the McCain chip advert. And how do we know when people truly are, thinking regeneratively? How do we challenge that, it's not just something on a website for a client, but they're not actually got regenerative principles? How would you recommend people challenge that? Go ahead, Ollie.
All right. My kind of emerging answer for this is as follows. One, ask that person positively, curiously, what is their vision for the future? What is their vision for thriving? Because the number one thing that the regenerative practitioner needs to do is to continually be asking, how do they see the world and how do we see us in it? And how do we see the act of our work actually contributing to making things better? So number one, ask them about their vision and find out about it. They may have one, they might not have one. Number two, ask them about what are they doing to actually move towards that transition, like to create the transition towards that. And three, ask them, what are they doing to dismantle existing negative things? Because as my mentor says to me, the existing system has a lot of immunity to our trying to change it. So actually, unless we are trying to stop some of the existing practices. It's just window dressing. So I think those are three really sort of tangible questions you can ask people.
Ollie, that's a great answer. I also think in this space, let's be honest, no, we're not going to get there on our own. We need to do this as an industry. This is a requirement for everyone working in the built environment to change the way we work. And therefore, we need to support each other and cheer each other on. So I'm much more excited about us calling out other people as regenerative, or calling out elements of their design practice as helping us transition towards that regenerative future. I'm much less excited about people calling themselves out as regenerative. So yeah, I think that's another part, is let's look around us. Let's find people who are doing great work, and let's celebrate it in a way that enables all of us to do this, make this transition.
But as an add to that, which is James and I use the word regenerative less and less, and actually are looking for the specific qualities in what people are proposing. So we have this living systems blueprint, which we've both alluded to, and I'm afraid you're going to have to read the details of it in the book. But it's this idea that living systems are interconnected, they use symbiosis, and they can self-organize and adapt. So if you want to create a regenerative design brief, you should be building an interconnection between the people and the places things are coming from. You need to be unlocking symbiosis and those resource loops. And you need to be actually enabling them to adapt on the basis of the feedback in the system. For me, those are real hallmarks of a process that is trying to be regenerative. So use that to interrogate what people are really doing.
Yeah, no, that's great. Before we go to the last question, there has been so many more questions that I wish we could go through them all. If you two are comfortable with it, if we can potentially get our heads together afterwards and put some answers back to the questions that we haven't been able to answer, because there's been loads, like hundreds, to be honest. So
great.
Great. Would love to.
It's hard to keep up with. So yeah. For those of you, if you haven't had your question answered this evening, it doesn't mean that we won't answer it. So yeah, we'll gather those afterwards, and any that we feel that haven't been answered in tonight's talk, we will go over and send some responses out. So my final question, I am going to take it back to the bookcase because I found it really I love a practical image of something that I can see in work, at home, out in the, you go to a coffee shop. A bookcase is something that you see everywhere. But many people potentially sat on this call now, we've spoke a lot. There's a lot of information that we've digested tonight. And, when people go to their desk tomorrow, we've said it's not a 5-minute change. We're not going to, have a regenerative industry tomorrow. But what are the small changes that people can make to their bookcase with the view to, change the paradigm at their desk tomorrow when they go to work? What are the small things that they can start to, be implementing to, become a regenerative practitioner? Potentially it doesn't have to be limited to structural engineering, but obviously a large portion probably are structural engineers on the call.
Maybe we can tag team this, James.
Yeah.
My first one is we've got to keep remembering what this is for. And actually the hardest part I find in all these conversations is keep returning it to the living world. So can you integrate into your day a little bit of time where you spend some time outside? Go and find a space where you can just sit quietly and just look at how incredible the living world is, and notice that, and just sit with that and go, how through my work could I be contributing to this? But you don't even need to think about it, just sit and engage with it. Research shows it is so powerful. It's good for our mental health. Yeah. And I think it's really going to connect you into keep coming back to that. Who are we serving? That's my starter for 10.
Yeah. I would really echo what Ollie has just said. My starter for 10 is to be curious about your supply chain and think about how you can learn more about your supply chain. Have a go at asking kind of putting into your specs that you want to see the full supply chain for your materials. You want to know where stuff comes from. You might, and then once you started being curious and you start getting answers, share those answers. Let other people know what you've discovered. Let's kind of collectively better understand our supply chains, better understand the real questions that we haven't yet asked, that we should be asking, and then let's start finding some answers. But let's start by being curious and really observing.
Yeah, that's great. To be honest, knowledge is power. If we don't know where our materials are coming from, how can we even begin to imagine the impact that they're having? Which I think is coming to light more and more and more about, the resources that we are using that are beyond just specking a steel beam out of a blue book, linking it back to, the Amazon rainforest where that iron ore has been mined.